some of our colleagues and partners are joining us online, we do recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you're currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and the current treaty holders of those lands. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon territory is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bond them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Welcome to our panel discussion on the 50-30 Challenge, which is an initiative that is pivotal in reshaping the landscape of Canadian workplaces towards gender, greater diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am Nadine Spencer, and I am honored to be here to moderate this very important conversation today. I am the founder of BrandEQ Agency, a strategic marketing and communications firm that I ran for many, many years, and of course, the former CEO and president of the Black Business and Professional Association, an organization that works to advance equity and create economic opportunity for Black entrepreneurs. The 50-30 Challenge represents a collaborative effort between the Government of Canada, Canadian businesses, and diversity organizations. Its fundamental goal is very clear. It's to foster environments where all Canadians, regardless of their backgrounds and identities, have an equal opportunity to contribute meaningfully. It's not just about meeting quotas. It is fundamentally about reshaping organizational cultures to be more inclusive and representative of the rich tapestry of our society. And so as we gather here today during International Women's History Month, it is crucial to recognize the significance of initiatives like the 50-30 Challenge in advancing gender equity and supporting underrepresented groups across all sectors of our economy. The intersectionality of this initiative amplifies its impact, acknowledging and addressing the multiple layers of discrimination and exclusion that individuals may face. Our incredible panelists brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to this discussion, representing academia, business leadership, research institutions, and together we truly aim to delve into the progress made thus far in meeting the 50-30 Challenge goals, identifying the challenges ahead, and exploring actionable strategies to further develop change. Throughout our conversation, we will explore not only benefits that diversity inclusion brings to organizations, but also to the broader societal impact of these initiatives. So, as we embark on this journey of dialogue and discovery, let us keep in mind the profound impact that our collective actions have on shaping more equitable, diverse, and successful future for all Canadians. I very much want to thank our partners, the Diversity Institute and Women of Influence Plus, for being a voice and being open to facilitate this kind of conversation, because it is in this spirit where we're able to make progress and move towards change. So I'd like to introduce our awesome, incredibly brilliant panelists. We have Tania Saba, BMO Chair in Diversity and Governance and Professor of University of Montreal. Welcome, Tania. We have Rumeet Billan, CEO of Women of Influence Plus. Rumeet, thank you for being here. We have Shannon Pestun, Senior Advisor, Business and Finance, WEC. Shannon, it's always a privilege to see you. And Nancy Mitchell, the incredible Nancy Mitchell, Director of Research Special Projects at the Diversity Institute. So I want to jump right in. And maybe Tania, I'll ask you the first question. Where do you see progress and where do you see challenges for organizations when implementing EDI strategy? And what role of voluntary codes, what is the role of voluntary codes like the 50-30 Challenge?
Well, thank you very much, Nadine, and for calling on me to start this very nice panel, and I'm so happy to be here and to be able to talk about the 50/30 challenge. I think all of us here around the table were so much involved also in looking at it in details, of course. So the progress, actually, we don't see that much progress. And I think that if we stay on regulations, we see that we are part of a country that is very proactive on questions of equity, on question of diversity. However, if we look at the regulations, its effectivity and the situation, we're not sure that we are really reaching the objectives in EDI, in equality, in equity, in diversity, and in inclusion. So I think the 50/30 challenge is really a great one, because first, it is a voluntary code. And in that sense, it comes and it complements regulations. As we know, our economy is based on small and medium-sized organization. And in order to reach them, more than 90% of our economy is small and medium-sized organization. And a voluntary code actually would help achieve some goals, and especially that it puts all the emphasis on managements and boards of directors. So in that sense, SMEs, it allows them to look at the whole system inside their organization and trying to plan for the legitimacy of their intervention. What is good about the voluntary code as well, and in this sense, the way that the 50/30 challenge was implemented, as you said, it's not about only quotas. There are KPIs, and what we're looking also, it's at the actions. And the most of actions, when we look at the 50/30 challenge and we look at the indicators, it's about correcting the system, making it better, making it more equal. It's not about introducing privilege to anyone. And in that sense, our workplaces become much more equitable, diversified, and inclusive. Also, it offers tools, and this is the basis for every code that you implement. You want small and medium-sized organization which have fewer resources, not necessarily all the expertise to put in place plans, action plans, to measure them. So when you give them tools, it makes it easier through the assessment tools, which also provides an education for small and medium-sized and even larger organization on what are the best practices to be implemented, and gives also, and I'm sure we're going to have the opportunity to talk about this, the 50/30 challenge offers a framework that is coherent, that makes it easier for organization when they intervene in terms of EDI, how to put in place something that is embedded in the mission of the organization, but also provides them with action that can be effective in terms of reaching the EDI goals.
Thank you so much for that, Tania. And, that's one of the things that I very much appreciate about it is the framework and the actionable steps that companies can take, because so many times there's a plan and where's the action towards that, and how do you measure that? And so, Nancy, I'm going to turn over to you for the same question. Just what's your response and thoughts on that, on the same question?
Yeah, for sure. My thoughts are similar to Tania. I think that with the challenge, you're seeing that it's really an opportunity for us to encourage organizations to be transparent and to take accountability. And I think that there's something to be said about a domino effect, where one big organization in an industry sets the tone and says, we're going to commit to this, and then others, for whatever reason, but I think we know why, decide to follow suit, and then everyone joins in. And I think that that's been, I guess, kind of the experience that I've seen with the challenge. And then in agreement with Tania, I think too that the challenge, what I've seen is, we have over 2,000 organizations that have signed up across Canada, but then at least in my work, they're coming back to me and saying, okay, we signed up. Where do we go? What can we do next? Where do we start? which I think is indicative of a commitment that exists and accountability that exists. And the challenge is not just the goals and numerical representation. It comes with, as Tania said, like real actions for change, real tips and templates and strategies that you can implement, and real frameworks for how you set those goals, how you set interim goals all the way up to the 50 and the 30, and how you monitor that and share your progress internally and externally. So ultimately, I think it's a great way of encouraging accountability and transparency. It leads to some sort of domino effect, and it comes with tangible strategies for change.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You know, you're absolutely right, and I love the the concept of the domino effect here, because you're right, and that's why it's important for leading organizations to take this first step, because then others follow, and they can also be a support for those organizations as well. So, Shannon, I'll turn to you. Any thoughts?
Thank you. I also love that domino effect analogy, and I'm going to take that. And I guess I'll start with, you know, I agree with Tania, like we have a starting point, but are we making progress at the rate that we should be? And I would argue that no, we're not. And there's over 2,500 organizations that have signed on to the challenge. And I think one of the important parts about the code and what it also is structured to do is that it hasn't taken just a one-shot approach to how we do this. There are different frameworks for corporations, large corporations, post-secondary institutions, small and medium-sized enterprises, municipalities, government, and civil society. So it's also recognizing that big corporations have different needs and different structures and different budgets and resources for this type of work. And I think when I'm out speaking with some, in particular the small, medium-sized enterprises, often there's those barriers to time and human resources and how they're going to monitor this. You know, I would say that you asked what some of the challenges are, and I think that part of the challenge is still how we view EDI and the role of EDI in this country. And I think that there are still a lot of people who think that this is the politically nice thing to do or the social nice thing to do. And we're not necessarily looking at the economic impact of what happens when everybody is given an equal seat at that table. And I would also say that we still see systemic racism and discrimination, and I think we need to continue to reinforce the challenges that come when we're not having those big, bold, courageous conversations about systemic change. So I think the role of this code is it gives us all an anchor, and it's setting and leading us to change. And Nadine, you said it earlier, it's that collective action. And I think sometimes people are scared because there's no silver bullet, you know, to how to approach this. I think people are sometimes scared to engage in this activity in case they get it wrong, in case they say something offensive or do something in the incorrect way. So I think the role of the code is it's collectively helping us to set examples, and what that signals to everybody else, to Nancy's point about the domino effect. So we just have a real opportunity to encourage all organizations to increase their representation and inclusion of diverse groups within all workplaces, but also highlighting the benefit and the wins that we all have when we have an inclusive, sustainable economy. So that's what I would say. I think that progress is slow to come, and I'd like to see us amplify that. And I think when we take a look at the number of organizations across Canada, 2,500 who have signed on to the code, we still have a really long way to go.
Yeah, very, very much so. But, you know, to your point, Shannon, the big, bold conversations is critical. We all must be a part of those big, bold conversations. And even if we're afraid, it's like those courageous conversations as well around EDI and what this means. And so, Rumeet, I know that, there we go. I just wanted to have you weigh in into this as well.
I love what the panelists have said and my peers and colleagues have said as it relates to the 50-30 challenge. I do want to actually build also on what was just shared by Shannon, and specifically talking about the challenges, because you can have an EDI strategy, you can have policies, you can have programs, you can have initiatives, but What we really need to focus on is accountability, right? So what actually happens when someone says something that is offensive or someone has gone against a policy? Recently at Women of Influence Plus, we did a survey, a large survey on ageism. And many respondents said, you know, ageism isn't a part of EDI and it needs to be a part of EDI. Although there has been progress made, there's still a lot of areas that we don't look at. As an example, at Women of Influence, we added a plus to our name because we take a complete intersectional lens when we're looking at different initiatives, programs, events that we do. And intersectionality is so incredibly important. And oftentimes, there are elements of intersectionality that are missing from DEI. And so, yes, we've made progress, but there's still a ways to go. And in addition to that, it's not just about strategy. We need accountability. So that's what I would add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. So the next question I will ask, maybe Rumeet, I'll start with you. You all come to this discussion with experiences in different sectors. What do you think your organization or the organizations you work with, what are the benefits and to EDI to your organization?
You know, we talk a lot at our organization about belonging. We do keynotes and workshops on the science of belonging. And when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we connect it to belonging, and by the way, there's a difference between real inclusion and surface inclusion. It's not just about asking people and checking the box, or when people feel as though you're asking me a question because you're supposed to do it, and I'm not included, I'm not accepted, I'm not actually involved. That actually goes against the efforts as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So first, we need to differentiate between real inclusion and surface inclusion. And when there is real inclusion, when people feel as though they are included, they're involved, they're accepted, that's what leads to belonging. And so a lot of times it's about, okay, we want to be inclusive, so we're going to invite everybody to the table. Everyone's invited to the event, the conference, the party, whatever it might be. And with all due respect, it's not about who you invite. It's about what happens when they get there. Because you can invite everybody to the table, but if they get to the table and they're silenced, ignored, or spoken over, that's not inclusion. And so when we think about the benefits, and when we think about what organizations, what the benefits are of implementing and actually holding people accountable, well, we create moments of belonging. We allow for those moments of belonging. We allow people to be who they are, to show up as who they are, so they're not coming to work pretending to be someone else. And I mean, there are a number of other benefits, and I'll leave it to the rest of the panelists, but I really wanted to make sure we emphasize this big point about belonging. And it's not about the number of people that attend your event. What we care about is what happens when they get there. What is their experience?
Yeah, absolutely. That's that authenticity and walking the talk when they get there. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I'll ask you, Shannon, what is your point on this?
Well, can I just say that I just have really come to hate this question because anytime that we still have to talk about the benefits to an organization reminds me that we're not making the progress that we should. So let me say, just the business case again, and it just, although it pains me that we have to continue to reinforce the business case of EDI and what the benefits are to an organization. I mean, I'll just go back to maybe flipping the question to say, what are we leaving on the table by not having this? And I think sometimes instead of saying, what are the benefits? It's like, what are the risks of us not doing this as an organization? And I'll take a look at just the labor force challenges right now that we have, the war on talent that we have. If we focus and broaden our EDI efforts, we're not going to have this talent pool issue. And there's a lot of skills and gaps that are sitting in untapped equity seeking groups. And Rumeet, I see your hand up. So, I mean, feel free to jump in here too, but it's also, how can you respond to the needs of your customers when you're not representing the customers? The people that are in your organization can't give their feedback to say how this is going to impact the market. And we know that when we bring diversity of thought, that there's an increase in innovation. We see deeper creativity. That diversity of thought allows us to question the assumptions that we have about our products. And I can think back to another panel that Nancy and I were on, just even how seat belts were never designed for women in mind and the health challenges that came with that. And there are a number of products. It's not just that, it's how AI, how we're developing products and testing them and bringing them to market, so that the benefits of EDI is that you're at risk of isolating more customers than you are at attracting the current customer base. And, finally, I would just say that there's also substantial legal and reputational costs when we have staff dissatisfaction, or there's racism claims, legal claims on human rights, or dissatisfied employees from a turnover perspective. So I don't think businesses or organizations can afford not to look at the benefits. But as I work in the business community, it's this, when we're talking about this at board levels and leadership levels, the question's not being asked about what are the benefits of it. And I think we have to start bringing the question is, what is the risk to this? Because the minute you start introducing risk, then business suddenly goes, oh, ding, 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 we might have a financial, reputational, legal risk. So I think that, it's tough that we're still having the conversation on the business case. And I think the way to ignite people around this is to say, we're leaving an awful lot on the table, and we're leaving ourselves highly exposed if we don't start implementing this in a meaningful and authentic way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The risks are paramount to this, and you're right. We're not paying enough attention to the risks. So I will turn it over to you, Nancy. Thoughts?
Nadine, can I jump in very quickly?
Yes, of course,
sorry,
Rumeet,
Nancy.
of course.
I just want to
Absolutely.
make just one point, because I think it's so important. And I got very excited when Shannon said it. We so often talk about the war for top talent. And what we don't focus on, just as we reframe from benefits to risks, we need to actually change the conversation. And it's about retaining our top talent, because our top talent is leaving when they experience things like ageism or tall poppy syndrome or whatever it might be. So we talk about war for top talent when actually we should be talking about retaining our top talent, because they are the ones that are leaving. So Shannon, thank you for reframing that, especially from benefits to risk. And I think we need to also reframe the conversation in HR about our talent.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. Thank you for that, Rumeet. Nancy.
Yeah, I won't repeat everything my colleagues have said, because I agree. I think that there's benefits internally and externally, whether you're thinking about talent, retention, whether people feel like they belong and their perspectives are valued and included, decision-making, and the ability to foster innovative ways to come up with solutions to complex problems. If everyone around the decision-making table looks like you, thinks like you, acts like you, how are you coming up with different solutions for your complex problems? But I just wanted to give two examples that I see like quite tangibly on the day-to-day that reflects this internal and external. So as you know, the populations in Canada are changing. Nevertheless, our leadership tables perhaps are not. And if you're thinking about your hiring, your retention, your recruitment processes, et cetera, if your company is not valuing what we call international skills as a bias that's baked in, then you're not actually best placed to attract and capture that talent that's coming in. You're missing out on talent pools. So there's very tangible things, even if you look at the language that's baked into your job posting, whether it's gendered language, whether it's ableist language, whether it caters or favors some people unintentionally and not others, then that's a barrier that's baked in, that you're not attracting the talent that's so diverse in Canada. Another example is supporting the people that access your programs or your services. If the marketing is not accessible, if the actual service in and of itself is not accessible for people with disabilities, you're missing out on a whole client base, right? If you even look at the marketing and there's no women in your marketing, there's no Indigenous people in your market, like that signals who you want accessing your services. And not only is it exclusionary and wrong, but now you've made your client pool smaller. So those are just two things that I think in the conversation that Shannon and Rumeet have shared, all of their points. I just wanted to share some tangible examples of barriers that exist that's limiting whether you're attracting diverse talent and whether or not you're actually engaging with consumers and clients that are diverse.
Yeah, Exactly. And in the marketing space, people have to see themselves represented. When we talk about representation, if we open that magazine or we look on that billboard ad and even in the language, it's the visual, but it's also the language we see. Well, what we've seen also is exclusionary language and not inclusive language. So there's so many areas to this. So thank you for sharing that also, Nancy. Tania, any thoughts on this question?
Yes, well, absolutely. And again, building on the very important ideas that were brought by the panelists, I would say that maybe just a different angle and maybe building on the notion of risk that was brought up by Shannon, I would say EDI is going to be at the heart of the sustainable economies and societies. And it's not just a statement. Ever since COP26, what we have been seeing is some international standards that are being set. And Canada, of course, is at the first row, bringing to the discussion and putting some standards in place. And I would say when we look at these standards, we look at environment, we look at societies, and we look at the social standards, and we look at governance. And EDI is both in the social and in the governance, and which are, of course, very much related to the economy. So if we do not, and if organization, and again, any sector, any size, is not paying attention to EDI, to diversifying leadership, to more equitable practices in the organization, where the risk is. And the risk is not being part of what is now going to be the sustainable finance, and even investors looking at these standards being met before they invest in companies. So this is first, the risk, and I think there is a lever there that's going to help a lot, force on codes like the 50-30 challenge, maybe also force on and try and help compel anyhow some of the regulations in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Also, if we look at the ILO research, what we see as well is that the new jobs in the green transition, in the digital transition, tend to be male-dominated sectors and professions. And we need to have a very serious look at what is happening in our organization, because the problem with EDI, if we do not go forward, we are going backwards. We're not even staying at the same level or at the same rates. So we have to keep really an eye, and we have to make all the effort that are going to be very much important, so that to be able to put these standards in place and to meet these sustainable standards that are going to be set. And this is in a very near future.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Tania, to all of you for sharing your points on that question. Now, our next question will delve into the drivers and obstacles surrounding implementation of EDI initiatives, from societal shifts to internal challenges. So let's shed some light on this. So Nancy, I'll ask you to go first. What do you see as the drivers and obstacles to implementing this change in society and in organizations? And what are some of the most important initiatives that have been undertaken to improve diversity in senior leadership?
Oh, it's a big question. I'm giving you the secret sauce here. I don't have all the answers to that, and I'm sure the other panelists have insights too. But what I would say is a couple of things I've noticed. I'll give two. The first is, it goes back to what Shannon said on inaction and the fear of getting it wrong. So not knowing where to start, and then being concerned that if you start, you're going to get it wrong, and thus people don't do anything at all. And then I also want to talk about the difference between large organizations and SMEs, because we know that there's different capacities, whether it's personnel, funding, et cetera. And that comes with, I guess, a perceived ability of what you can do related to EDIA. So I think overall, my perspective is that if you are one of those organizations that you want to start, but you don't know where to start, and you're worried about getting it wrong, so you're not doing anything, is really looking at the strategies that you already have. Presumably you have some sort of corporate strategy. Perhaps you have a talent acquisition strategy. Like, you as an organization have missions, goals, values, and things, processes that you've put in place. And EDIA works best when it's not an add-on, when it's baked in. And so if you have a talent acquisition strategy already, how are you looking at that and saying, okay, we seem to be attracting a lot of the same folks. Our job postings are really convoluted and don't use inclusive language. How can we ensure that our hiring team is aware of biases, for example? Like looking at the strategy that you already have and considering how that strategy can be more inclusive, I think is a great way to start, because you're looking at what already exists and then thinking about how it can be better, rather than saying we have to do all these extra EDIA initiatives that don't connect to the things we're already doing. Then it's an add-on and you're more likely to get it wrong because it's not authentic. You're just doing for the sake of doing, rather than looking at your strategy and saying, let's bake it in. And then that similarly brings me to my point about SMEs. I think that oftentimes when I'm engaging with smaller organizations, they're saying, well, Nancy, we're just trying to keep the lights on and the water running, and we maybe only have a couple of staff we're trying to hire. We don't have the capacity to think about all these things. But I actually think it's better to think about EDIA in your growth when you're small. Because imagine you get to be an organization with 100 people, and now you're thinking, how are we going to support diverse clients? How are we going to bring diverse people in? If you only have 5 people, this is a great place to start. You're foundationally building up those missions, values, the policies that frame your organization moving forward. Bake it in from the beginning, even just in a policy you have, or what are your mission, vision, and values? Bake it in there from the beginning. And that way, as you grow, it can evolve, rather than getting to be 100 people deep and then saying, we got to amend our vision. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, you're so right. It's easier to start when you're smaller. I mean, small organizations think, oh, I don't have the time, I don't have the resources. But according, the E-Myth talks about, you have to build your strategies when you're small, because then when you scale and you're larger, you then have it in place and you have a foundation already set. So that's a very great point. I'll turn it over to you, Shannon, to respond to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about this one as well. And, you asked the question, like, what are the drivers and what are the obstacles? And you're right, Nancy, it's a big question. And, I would say the number one thing is it has to start from the top. This is a strategic initiative. If companies want to get it right, we have to build it into everything. As Nancy said, baking it in. And I agree, these are easier to start when you're a younger company, a smaller company, because you have less to undo. You have less of, barriers in your systems to have to roll back. And so, it does need to start at the top. And that's not just the C-suite position, that's governance as well. But as I've come and doing more work, and as I've come to understand, it's how that gets pushed down the entire organization. Often I'll hear, well, this leader's really good, but this leader isn't. And so being able to tie it back to metrics, how are we measuring EDI against the performance of our leaders as well? Like, it's a very systems approach that we need to be able to take. And so we can't have good governance and good oversight of this if we're not going to embed this into our overall corporate or organizational strategies. And it's not something that can live in just one part of the organization. It needs to move across the entire part of the organization. And so asking ourselves, like, what are our culture and what are our values? And again, I'll go back to those courageous conversations of whom are we supporting, who are we hurting, and who are we helping, who's being left behind by our current processes or our current policies. And so I think it's really important that if you don't know where to start by going to the people in your organization, asking them. Engagement surveys can really help track culture and help you expedite the learning in your organization. So if resources are tight, you can start focusing on where most of the employees in your organization are going to say the gaps are. And of course, I can't say enough about the importance of what gets measured gets done. So we need to be able to tie accountability frameworks to this. Are we seeing an increase in diversity in our organization? Are our systems equitable? Are we inclusive? Do we create that sense of belonging? Is accessibility there? Or are we potentially putting up other barriers or unaware of other barriers? And then how do we bring that across the value chain. And so, you know, as an organization, we'll have our primary activities, but how do we make sure that it goes inside the whole organization? But then how do we bring that to our suppliers and through our procurement and through how we're developing our products, our human resources management? And so to me, it's very much a systems thing. We don't have to make it complicated. We don't have to make it scary. We have starting places, because if we're measuring data already inside our organizations, that's going to also give us a clear snapshot of what our organization looks like today. But I think part of on the other side of this, if these are some of the enabling factors, I think one of the other barriers, though, is that we still have to promote data for good and how organizations are using this data. And there's a lot of mistrust in all of our systems. And so we have to, as employers and leaders, talk about how we're using this data to empower equity, diversity, and inclusion, accessibility, and belonging into our organization. So I think Nancy gave some great examples, but there's one that I want to pull to, and it's more from the finance sector, but I think there's lessons that can be learned in this. And this is something called the Allison Rose Code that was accepted in the UK. And this was, the UK was looking at why do we have so much disparity or a gap in women's entrepreneurship in this country? And a voluntary code was able to bring together the entire financial community. So there was banks, venture capitalists, venture funds, everyone was coming together to say, we're going to start putting our metrics out there so that we can actually track how much capital is being deployed to this group of entrepreneurs. And so it is possible. And again, that collaboration. And if you don't know where to start, maybe you are a small company, look at your peers. Ask what's working. Sharing best practices is another thing that we can do to help us move forward more quickly together.
Thanks, Shannon. You've covered so much in there. Great concepts. I think sharing best practices is one of the best ones, because whether you're a 5-person organization or a 5,000-person organization, sharing best practices is a great place to start and build on for these types of initiatives. So Tania, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Nadine. I always come after Shannon and Nancy, and I don't think I have so much to say, especially they have covered, again, very important grounds and ideas. But, you know, the only thing I would have to say is that, so the 50-30 challenge is your answer. Why? First, because it builds on sound research that links a diversified leadership to sustainable outcomes and to economic growth and to innovation. So this we know, and now it's much easier to make today the business case around diversity, because we have so many studies out there that do these units, and again, scientifically. What is interesting about the 50-30 challenge, and from what Shannon and Nancy has said so far, first, it starts at the top. It's the leadership on boards and in the C-suites. So second, it has a framework. So all this lack of expertise that you see in SMEs, which is understandable because of the size, sometimes the being afraid to start something. What is the impact? Do I really want to talk about discrimination in the organization? Will I be able to handle it, etc.? Well, the framework sets up some good practice, even some best practice, and gives an idea of at least where to start. Second, you have the framework. You have also the assessment tool. So you know where you stand. There's an education to that. And I think also it sets the measurement. It sets the accountability on how to measure if you have reached or not your goals. So again, the framework, and especially for small and medium-sized organization, is there, and it addresses most of the barriers, most of the difficulties that we usually encounter in this type of exercises. The only thing that the 50-30 challenge cannot cover is the commitment to do this. And it's do organization really want to do something about it. And this is where I think that we need some levers coming from maybe outside. And this is where sustainability standards, and this is where regulations, And this is where competition and comparison between organization and international standards makes it easier, maybe, to push a little bit for that commitment towards more diverse workforces, but more diverse leadership, and setting really more equitable standards inside organizations.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Tania. Thank you. So, you know, our final question, it's going to look at strategies. So when we talk about EDI, you all know we're the converted. You're preaching to the converted, right? And so it often rests with the people who don't get it. So or see it as window dressing strategies. So what are some of the strategies that you've used to engage people and to build a commitment? You know, one of the strategies that I've used in different organizations and so forth is I talk about the authenticity piece. I talk about the authenticity piece, and I say if you're around a table that does not look like the UN, you really have to think to yourself, you know, how inclusive are we in this space? How inclusive are we in this space? If you're in an environment, it does not look like your community when you go out, what does that mean? And how do we move towards getting our environment to reflect our community? So share with me, I'll start with you, Rumeet, in terms of the answer to the question, what are some of the strategies that you've used to engage people and to build commitment?
Thank you for that. And I'm gonna answer this piece, and then I'm also gonna add to the question that was just asked. So in our organization, one big piece, and we've really gone in on it as of last year, is research. So I'm a researcher. I love research. And my whole thing is, how do we take research, how do we take data, and how do we share the stories in a meaningful way? And so over the last 2 years, we did a huge international study on tall poppy syndrome, how women experience or what they experience when they achieve something or they're successful at something, and when they're cut down, and what the impact is on the individual, on the organization, and on all of us. And then this year, as I mentioned earlier, we did research on ageism, and again, the impact on the individual, organization. And when we do research, it's not just about, you know, what is the problem? It's about how do we all come together in a way where we can support. So the way that we've been able to engage not just those who are converted, but our entire community, is through our research and then what we put out there. One thing I do want to share, and it adds to the question that was just asked and what the panelists have shared, is in both pieces that we've done in the last 2 years, and something that I firmly believe in, yes, I do agree it starts at the top, but respectfully, I would also say it actually starts with every single one of us. And so oftentimes, and our respondents had said this, especially with tall poppy syndrome, it's like, you know, we say it starts at the top, and yes, that is true, but we also have to take accountability for ourselves, how we show up, how we choose to act, how we choose to react and interact with others. Am I engaging in microaggressions and I'm not even aware of it? And so when we take that lens of, yes, it starts at the top, it needs to, but it actually also starts with every single one of us, that's when I think we can see that shift in society. And I also think that is a way in which we try to engage everyone, where it's like, okay, it's not just one person, it's not just them, it's all of us and how we choose to show up.
Thank you. Thank you, Rumeet, for sharing that. Thank you very much. Nancy, what are your thoughts?
Sure. I guess when we're talking about preaching to those that are not converted, there's a couple of things. It goes back to the why. And, you know, to Shannon's point, there's a little bit of fatigue of having to constantly explain why it's important, but I always try to connect it to that organization's goals. So if you are, for example, a mental health care provider, your goal is to provide services to support communities. Now you have to think about all the different barriers that different communities experience to actually access your service. And when you're using EDIA and you're breaking down those barriers, then different communities can come and get the support they need. So every organization has a why, they have a mission, they have a goal. And anytime I'm engaging with different organizations, I'm pinpointing that why and then trying to articulate how EDIA helps move that why forward. So that's something that I try to kind of embed in my thinking when I'm addressing those that are not the converted. Something that I also get often from people that are perhaps not on board is, well, this is an issue that exists in other organizations, but not in ours. And I want to go back to Tania's point about benchmarking. And I think this is where the diversity assessment tool really comes into play as well, is trying to understand where you're at. So what the diversity looks like in the organization and where some of the gaps are, as a way to say, this is not an issue that exists elsewhere. This is something that exists in your organization, and here's some of the evidence that exists, and now here's what we're going to do about it. So you have the naysayers that, ultimately don't understand how EDIA moves their organization forward and their strategies for that. You have the naysayers who think that it doesn't exist for them, it exists elsewhere, but not for them. And I think that's where the benchmarking and the understanding of the experiences on the ground take place. And that's how you can kind of leverage data to say this exists for you too. And then I would also say that if you're not on board, then I think you might be a little bit left in the dust, because I think this is where we're headed. I think there's kind of becoming a collective awakening and recognition that we need to be breaking down barriers. And I think that if you're not getting involved, then you're not going in the direction that a lot of people are going in.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask you, who haven't I asked on this conversation? Tania?
Yes, thank you, Nadine. Well, I would go back to Rumeet's point as well, saying that, and I think Rumeet, you're very right. What we have done, and in terms of research, is for many years we had to concentrate on identifying the barriers, on identifying the motives for discrimination. I think that now we are one step forward, and it's about breaking those barriers. And to break the barriers, I think that what we need is evidence-based data and evidence-based research. And we're getting there. What we see, for instance, is if we look at the survival rate in organization, between those who have the best survival rates are organizations that are led by women and men. So we see again the diversity in leadership. If we look at innovation, we thought that in terms of the differences in terms of innovation, there was a gap between organizations led by women or led by men, which is completely not true. And this is what recent research is showing us. And of course, we have to rely on Statistic Canada, on the reports that are done, that are countrywide, and that shows how organizations that are led by, if it's groups for racialized or Black people, with the people, women, men, etc., and see the differences and look at the type of data that we need so that we can make break those assumptions that have been running and on which we still think that we need to rely, so to make up the decision and when recruiting people on board or recruiting people for on C-suites.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Shannon, I'm going to give you the last thought on this before we open it up to our audience for questions. Audience members, please do put your questions in the chat and we'll get to it right after Shannon's comments.
Well, I love everything that the panelists said about this, and maybe I'll be somewhat more provocative in some of the things that I'm about to say. And when I think about the challenges that I've seen and challenges that I've had to overcome in trying to drive some of the initiatives forward, I think I'm going to speak more from heart here and personal experiences. I think it's important. I think it's important to share, because we're, in this case too, I would say it's likely that most of the people who are on this call and listening to us today are not those that need to be preached to. They understand the importance of this work, and it's the same thing when we have conferences and EDI is on the agenda. The people who are there are typically the practitioners who are doing this work already. And so I think there's a big challenge that many of us have, and I'm very fortunate because I do work with the Diversity Institute, and so I've had a front row view into the research and the best practices, and I can speak from the data level. And I think that's given me a lot of that's been a huge driver for me personally, because when we have the data and we can identify the barriers, now we can say, what are we going to do to address these barriers? But I'm sensing, and as I'm chatting here, I'm calling in from a conference that I'm at, and I'm in Boston right now. And I'll tell you, the temperature here around EDI is very polarized. And You know, and I hear now new acronyms or new words that are filling in the EDI bucket, or DEI as they'll call it here. And I'm hearing things like division, exclusion, indoctrination around DEI. And I think that we have to really pay attention to where this is becoming a polarizing conversation. And I think a lot of that is driven by fear. And most of the leaders that I've spoken to who don't have this on the agenda, who don't have this value, I think that there's this sense of, as we build targeted programming that are going to raise one group up or some groups of people up, that it means taking away from someone else. And we have to get out of that mentality to keep talking about the collective win for everyone in this picture, because it does feel like us, them in many of the conversation circles that I've been a part of. So I think we have to address the fear. And I think what we can really do is invite leaders to learn and to listen and to really hear the stories, the lived experience of people who are in their teams, and listen to learn. And there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen within our structures, because again, many of these are systemic barriers. Many leaders walked into some of the systems that were already created. And so we have to think about, is this a cycle that we want to continue? When I take a look at the future generation, and I take a look at the millennials who are coming up, who are soon going to be 75% of the workforce, they come with a totally different value set. You know, they come looking for things like purpose and impact, and how is my role going to make a difference? And I would say too, that this generation, like this is really the first generation of workers who grew up with social media, who grew up with a broader sense of the world and an understanding of big world problems. And this will be the generation that has to solve complex global problems, societal problems, economic problems, climate problems together. But I don't think that they're the same generation that is in front of us, and sometimes still the generation that I'm in. So I'm very hopeful for what they're about to bring to the table. And I also can't help but think that, you know, as more people come into the workforce demanding that their cultures are inclusive, demanding that they can tie to something greater than themselves, eventually what will happen is, Nancy said, companies are going to be left out of the dust. They'll be left behind, because you're not going to have customers anymore. You're not going to have people who want to work for your organizations. And with regulatory environment changing as well, then your stakeholders are going to be demanding that you look a certain way as well. So I think that the barrier for me is an emotional one, is tends to be the one that I see. There's a resistance to it, but understanding where that resistance is coming from. And I think that it's also really important that we continue to reward the leaders who are doing an exceptional job, and not necessarily spotlighting those who aren't. But if we can continue to raise the profile of those who are, and who are making a difference in their organizations. Others, I've seen it happen in social change before. You know, that collective one, the conscience of one person can change the efforts of one person can change the entire conscience of an organization. It is possible. And so I think we have to continue to promote those people who are doing exceptional things and taking those risks. And we also have to really, I think, protect those who are doing this work every single day, because there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into this. There's a lot of personal reflections that go into this work as well. I love Nancy's idea of the thought around the benchmarking. And I'll say too, the 50-30 challenge, we have the What Works toolkit, so we can start helping organizations assess themselves against other organizations. And that might be a good starting place, just to say, where are we in all of this? But at the end of the day, we really have to think about our values as a society, values as organization, values as government, and really think about the world that we want to see. And somebody at this conference yesterday said, like, we want to be good ancestors. So what does that mean? And that really kind of left me feeling empowered to keep going with this work. But I just think it's an education process, and as much as we want to shout out how important EDI is, I think sometimes we have to meet people where they're at. And I hope that's where this question, where you're hoping to get an answer from on this question, but it's more of a personal, I guess, response than an academic one.
Thank you for sharing that. You know, and we have to bring heart into these conversations. You know, we talk about humanizing brands and humanizing policies and institutions, and this is a part of it. So I want to thank you, Shannon, for sharing that. Thank you very much. We have questions and we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to bring some questions to the panelists who, if you're able to answer, one of the questions is from Leslie. Are public school boards signing up for this 50-30 challenge?
Yeah, and maybe I can just jump in and say, I mentioned earlier, there are different streams. So if you're part of government or you're part of a large organization, municipalities or post-secondaries, there's different streams within the 50-30 that are earmarked to help understand the nuance and the environments in which these organizations operate. So I do see that the 50-30 challenge has been put inside the chat. Go in there and take a look at where we've seen like chambers of commerce, post-secondaries have signed on, K-12 organizations have signed on. So we're certainly seeing diversity in the organization types, but there are different streams so that you can take a peek at. And all the signatories so far that have signed on have the opportunity to be identified on that list, and that's where we get that we know there's over 2,500 signatories to date. So you can see that list there.
Thank you. The next question, I echo Shannon's point about polarization. I've heard some people, whether individuals or groups, sadly even politicians, lawmakers, using wokeness to neutralize the purity of the diversity, equity, and inclusion accessibility efforts and encouraging separatist ideologies. How do we address that? Big question. How do we address that?
It's a huge question. And I think, you know, that all that we can do again is to listen and educate, and we have to stay deeply committed to this work. I think that it's one of those things where you can't fight fire with fire as well. The minute, you know, we have to continue to show the benefits of it and show those moments of change for organizations, sharing those best practices, sharing what's working for organizations. Because the reality is it just because this, I'll say this is in many cases an emotionally charged issue, and you get that level of polarization. Sometimes you need to just continue to just to educate, and you have to listen. And sometimes that's really hard because what we have to hear back sometimes is very challenging. But we will continue to find those great stories of organizations who are doing great things, and we have to role model and demonstrate what we want to see this to look like.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we're wrapping up, we have 2 minutes left, and Rumeet, I'm going to give you that last 2 minutes to have a final point.
I'm very appreciative to even be on this panel. I mean, I've learned so much from everybody, and I think the questions that have been coming in are fantastic. There are a number of resources out there. There's one question that was in there that was asking about free courses. I think it was about free courses that might be available out there, accessible EDI courses. You know, I would encourage you to check on LinkedIn, LinkedIn Learning. I know that they have some free and accessible courses there. And I think there are a lot of articles that are coming out and just staying in the know of what people are talking about. But in terms of recommendations for free and accessible EDI courses, highly recommend going on LinkedIn. I'm just appreciative to be on this panel and to have learned from the panelists, because my views have even shifted in terms of the way I view EDI. And my last kind of word is, and I say this to my team, who is phenomenal, I have the best team. For us, it's not just about talking about it, it's about being it, right? We show it through our work. We don't have to tell everybody what it is that we're doing, or we're doing this and this is our strategy. We are it, and we have to be it. And I think that is incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. I see that as a campaign. We are it.
Yeah.
So to each and every one of you, thank you so very much for your brave, courageous conversation in this dialogue today. You know, Shannon, you talked about sharing best practices. I think that's a great takeaway. Nancy, you talked about in the marketing, we need to see ourselves, representation in initiatives, in visuals, and even in language. Tania, you talked about it starts at the top. You're absolutely right. There has to be a solid commitment from the top. And Rumeet, you talked about, you know, how do we, all of us, come together? I think that collaboration is critical and key. So thank you very much for this brilliant conversation, and let's keep the dialogue going. Let's keep the commitment going and the sharing as we continue to support one another. a happy International Women's Month. We continue to inspire inclusion for all of us. Thank you. Merci.
Merci. Thank you for leading us through that conversation, Nadine. You are such a thoughtful moderator, and you really created space to have heart-to-heart conversations. So thank you.
Thank you as well. Merci.